Hey everybody, Ryan here with Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back after over a year to Explained. Today we are talking about parallel signal chains, how they relate to biamping, sidechaining, parallel compression, parallel wet effects, dry effects, and probably some other things that I'm forgetting. Today's episode kind of builds off the last installment, which talked about compression, distortion, how they can relate to one another, how one can kind of cause the other. So you'll want to have at least a decent understanding of some of those concepts that we talked about before coming into this video. Do go watch that if you're interested. But today we're going to be talking about a lot of the tactics that are used in both studio and in some cases even live tones to achieve tones that are otherwise basically unobtainable with a singular serially configured rig. But before I get going, what do I even mean when I say a parallel signal path? Well, for us guitarists especially, most of the time, our rigs, our signal chains look something like, guitar into pedal board, out to an amplifier, amplifier out to a cabinet, the cabinet speakers maybe hit a microphone, the microphone goes to a recording interface to your workstation of choice. All of those things for a recording signal chain kind of go in to out to in to out to in. Over and over and over, so on and so forth. Just like the junky Christmas lights of old, this is indeed a serial signal path where one effect feeds the other directly. You're hearing the combined stacked effect of a high output level pedal hitting a tube preamplifier, hitting a saturated power amp, hitting the speakers, so on and so forth. But even in that relatively simple signal chain, a lot of us, without realizing it, probably have some parallel signal paths going on. An easy pedal or VST plugin example of this would be an echo effect, like a reverb or a delay. This mix control brings in the delay lines into your signal path. If there was no mix control, all you would hear is that dotted eighth repeat or whatever time that you're using, and would be completely unwieldy and not fit at all. So we use the mix control to bring that down in relation to the dry signal. That way you can still hear what you're playing in real time, but then you have this effect that lags behind and kind of creates this space. Same thing goes for reverb. You wouldn't want to hear just the washed out, roomy ambience. You want to hear the dry signal as well. Also, many modulation effects have a wet-dry mix control that the user can tweak, but even if it's not exposed on the pedals or the plugin's control scheme, it's doing some sort of parallel signal routing under the hood. Take, for example, a classic CE1, CE2 chorus. It's a combination of a dry signal path plus a pitch modulated path. You get rid of the dry path, it's no longer a chorus. It's actually a vibrato. So in both of these examples, even under a single enclosure, what we often think of as a simple in-out procedure actually has a little bit of parallel processing built in by default. The difference with these examples versus what we're going to be discussing more in depth today is that these automatically kind of sum those signal paths together. That way you still only have that single output. Whereas what we'll be doing today, we can actually choose where they meet, if they meet at all, whether we sum them back together, we pan one left or right, we manipulate the frequency response of one path and not so much on the other one, we distort one or compress one. And that is the power of parallel signal paths in general, is that you can treat each one differently to achieve those effects where maybe you're filling in the gaps of one path, or you need to delay one line and not the other, so on and so forth. This sort of thing can easily induce option paralysis for some of us, but I'm going to strip this video down to about half a dozen or so examples that are grounded in real studio and live guitar rig use cases, which I think you can quite easily replicate in whatever audio workstation program that you use, or a sufficiently powerful amp modeling unit. Or if you're really brave and have the cash, you can indeed do all this stuff with analog gear. You're just going to need a lot more buffers, splitters, summers, crossovers, and things that we're not going to get into the exact details of today. This is more of the layout and less about the how each individual thing works. The example workhorse for today is going to be the Fractal Audio FM9, because in addition to having outstanding models of all the effects that we're going to be talking about today, as it is 3rd gen Fractal after all, it also has the ability to run 2 amplifier and cabinet blocks at the same time to show off some of the bi-amping examples I'm going to go over in this video. It can be done with real amplifiers, of course, My studio setup is not exactly conducive to doing that so easily, as everything's kind of fed into the same switch, and you know, a couple clicks of the mouse and you have a whole new rig set up on this elegant machine. So you're going to hear the effects of everything I'm talking about through this. Sounds freaking amazing. I share my deepest sympathies for those of you that have been on the wait list for this for almost going on a year at this point. It took me a while, but thankfully I do have mine. So the first thing we're going to start off with is a stereo amplifier example. This one kind of hits closer to home to a lot of guitarists, I think, in the sense that, you know, in a live show, if you're a single guitarist band, you're not going to have that double tracking sound if you only have a single amplifier tone being piped to front of house in mono. So what you'll see especially a lot of club players do for single guitar player bands is maybe they'll have a small combo on the left side of the stage. It's like a Voxy kind of thing, and then a more plexi or even Fendery style combo on the other side of the stage, and you get a wider stereo image, and it doesn't sound quite as narrow. It sounds more true to an album sound. And from my experience, from the listener's perspective, it just helps the guitars cut better through the mix without ever being overbearing. It sounds more detailed, more full, and just better all around, in my opinion. So we're going to replicate that with the Fractal FM9 for every demo here. If the blocks are grayed out, they're not being used. You can just assume if they're above or below a block, they're bypassed, they're not contributing whatsoever to the sound. And if they are colored in, then you're hearing the tonal contributions of those blocks. So in this example, we're going to hear a Mesa rectifier tone hard panned left, a more Marshall-inspired Cameron Atomica sound hard panned right, and then I'm going to add just a sprinkle of delay to one of those lines, about 10-15 milliseconds, because if you don't account for any differences and they're perfectly in sync and there's no phase differences, then it can sound a little funny in the center stage. So just a little bit of offset actually helps to make them sound that much more full, and it doesn't feel weird to play through. So that is where, you know, a digital control like this or one of those Haas effect pedals that exist out there would help a lot with those real amplifier rigs. While the last example can sound great for rehearsal and live scenarios, this next one is a little more applicable to studio players. And even if you're a single guitar player band or a solo project like me, you're most likely not ever going to just put down a single mono rhythm guitar sound and just put it center in the mix. You're probably double tracking, maybe even quad tracking, and maybe if you're James Hetfield or totally insane, octa tracking. And you can still reap some of the benefits of that stereo amp example because you don't have to put all those guitars through the same guitar rig. You don't even have to use the same guitar for all those tracks. In fact, the whole name of the game, in my opinion, when it comes to quad tracking or beyond, is to fill in the gaps that you can't achieve with double tracking. Most of the time, if I'm doing something like that, the doubled tracks will have an almost identical guitar sound on each side, and then the layers that are tracked underneath that will do something to complement those in some ways. Oftentimes, it's a change in distortion level, whether it be higher or significantly lower to accentuate the pick attacks and the palm mutes a little better. And maybe it's filling in some frequency gaps where it's more fizzy on the high end and fills in some of the low mids if your initial amp sounds were a little more high mid heavy and a little bass heavier and a little more liquid sounding. You just kind of have to balance those things out for personal preference. What I would not recommend is that you stick the same amplifier sound and the same cabinet, all that right on top of each other, because even when you start mixing them lower, you get diminishing returns, in my opinion. So one of those examples you can get overwhelmed with, but I think it can absolutely be a game changer in especially your mixes or live rig if you do this correctly on an amp modeler. So for the next example, with the centered amps, this would be something that, I would definitely quad track with and put one sound through one and one sound through the other. We're going to use kind of the classic Adam Jones setup using a Diesel amplifier sound blended with a Marshall Super Lead in this example. Not exactly the same amp that he uses, but again, trying to balance a more vintage crunch sound, a little more mid-focused, with something more contemporary to fill in the gaps. This next phenomenon was literally integral to the recording process for decades, and when the transition to digital happened, people missed it so much that they started reamping sounds through outboard gear and developed VST plugins to bring those sounds back. In this instance, I'm talking specifically about tape distortion, but this can pretty much apply to any console or post-instrument saturation, distortion, and overdrive. What I mean is when we plug something like a digital amplifier modeler or just track an instrument straight into the DAW, that's it. It is a clean digital signal. Whatever you put in is what you get. But for literally decades, you would have this stack up of console distortion because you're pushing either a tube or more oftentimes a transistor-based console, and you get a little bit of, harmonic distortion there, and then you put it through tape and you get some warble and a little bit of distortion there, and it all adds up and it sounds, a little bright and, a little gristly, but really pleasing to the ear. And we lost all of that by going straight digital. So a lot of that has been added back in the form of plugins and different outboard devices that, a lot of engineers still use to this day. But it's been especially common on guitar mixes and mix buses in general to add different aspects of those sounds in different ranges of the frequencies. There's all sorts of plugins that replicate this kind of behavior nowadays, with perhaps FabFilter Saturn being the most commonplace out of all of them. I really like a lot of the stuff that Isotope does as well. There's transformer saturation plugins, mic preamps, that sort of thing. What I tend to like to hear in a mixing environment is a little bit of transformer saturation on the low end, kind of glues everything together. It sounds big and push without sounding distorted. I like maybe a little bit of tape saturation and distortion in the mid-range, just mixed up just slightly to add some of those harmonics that we're normally missing. And then something that goes a little light on the distortion for the high end. Just, you don't want too much busyness in the extremely high frequencies, but something that just adds a little bit of dirt and maybe a slight bit of compression just to bring it all together. And to kind of replicate that and do something that I know everyone's friend Buster likes to employ on his mixes, we're going to add some distortion post-cabinet on this guitar signal chain. Something that kind of hard, if not impossible, to replicate with analog gear and still hear it in the room, because this would require overdriving some mic'd signal. But for an amp modeler, we can take our clean, amplifier through cabinet signal chain and then put a tape distortion after it and mix it in parallel. So generally you don't want this stuff 100% mixed because it's just going to sound flubby and weird. With this though, we can actually kind of band pass it, saturate some of those critical frequencies in the mids, get a little bit of sparkly high end, and make some absolutely evil tones with it in the process. In this tape example, we were further distorting an already distorted signal path, but fundamentally speaking, if you strip away the effects coming in before the tape block, we're really adding distortion to a clean signal path and blending in between the two. And this is something you can see on all kinds of contemporary drive and even compressor pedals for both bass and guitar. It's becoming increasingly common to see these blend controls on stuff that is based off of something like a tube screamer topology or a rat, things that people find can kind of overtake their sound, whether it be that pronounced mid hump or just the hard clipping nature that does not let a lot of the fundamental characteristics of their guitar through. Well, they've solved that by adding back a little bit of the clean blend, and you kind of get this in-between sound that makes it a little more pure for some people. This has been common for years on bass guitar, where you can take pedals from someone like a Dark Glass or a Tech 21, and they also have blend controls. In this example, these are kind of full frequency range blends, where all the way over here is the distorted signal, whatever you're getting from these DI pedals, and as you roll back, you're hearing more of the clean or whatever signals coming into them. This is oftentimes added to give back some of that high-end string bite that you get on plucks or picks on a bass guitar that might get a little distorted or muddied with the onboard overdrive. And it also adds some clean low end, because if you overdrive bass too much, you kind of get this synthy, blocky sound that may not be too pleasant. So this is a feature that's been dominant in the bass guitar market for literally decades at this point. But it doesn't have to be quite so straightforward, and we can actually combine this method with that less straightforward example. Because what bass players used to do, and some of them still do this, to achieve that clean on dirty sound was a bi-amp rig, just in the same way that we showed off with a guitar player's rig. But in this example, it is more disparate. One of them would be far more overdriven than the other, and oftentimes you can combine that with a crossover, where you send the higher frequencies to that dirty side and the lower frequencies to the clean side. You can get all sorts of pedals that do this. There's a lot of actually DI boxes specifically for bass that are built around this. But in the DAW world, it's really easy. You just split your track into two. You'd add a high pass filter to one side, a low pass filter to the other side, send them out through different outputs or the same output and reamp at different times. Ta-da, you're done. Or if you're doing all this with plugins, extremely simple. But for this example with the FM9, we're going to do just that in parallel. I'm going to send everything above about 300 hertz to a dirty rig. This will consist of the Dark Glass B7K model driving an Ampeg SVT, going through a blend of 4x10 and 4x12 cabinets to get that mid-range crunch and clank that we want to hear in metal basses. But the cool thing about this signal path is on the Dark Glass pedal, I'm also employing that blend knob. So we're actually getting a little bit of bite and crunch and a little bit of clean going through a crunchy amplifier. So you get all sorts of textures mixed there, even on that one signal path. Then for the second path, everything under 300 hertz is going to go to a mostly clean Ampeg SVT through a bigger 8x10 and 1x15 sub rig. So this will give that solid, fundamental, clean low end that is still desperately needed from a bass guitar, while still delivering this huge crunch monster tractor sounding metal bass. I mentioned a moment ago that you'll find a lot of contemporary compressors out there with a mix control to blend back in some of the clean signal. We'll certainly explore that here in a moment. But compressors also bring us to a whole new side of parallel processing, So far, we've pretty much only explored those that you can still hear, those that are affecting different parts of the signal chain, and they all sum back together to hear this cohesive thing. But when it comes to compression, especially, and you can do this with multiple effects, but compression is certainly the one that comes to mind the most because these things are often side-chained. So the side chain is essentially the signal path that a compressor or basically any other distortion or dynamic range manipulator responds to. And a lot of the times, the side chain and the audio signal path is one and the same, which is why, you'll get a big peak reduction on a compressor if you hit your strings hard, and then less so when you don't hit them as hard. And it really doesn't matter what frequency or what note you're hitting, how many ever dBs in, you're going to get the same amount of signal peak reduction. But with a sidechain filter, you can actually make a compressor respond differently depending on what you feed it. And in fact, for really complex sidechains, you don't even have to have the compressor respond to the instrument in question. More on that in a moment. So for this example, I have the compressor sidechain cut to look at only everything 1000 hertz and above. This means the low notes of the guitar played really softly aren't going to induce really any noticeable compression. It's on those higher strings when you're soloing or playing a lead that you're going to start to see some gain reduction, and it's going to even out the perceived volume and indeed the sustain across the entire guitar, playing into this kind of edge of breakup scenario. So that's one way that you can do sidechain, by filtering the signal coming into it. Again, a lot of these higher end compressors, especially the hardware models, have this kind of stuff where you can split up your signal path, plug a cable in, and you're good to go. One of the more complicated ways to do it that has been especially popular in metal mixes is to send a whole different signal through the sidechain and have it affect a different instrument. So one very common example is to have the kick drum be the sidechain signal, and then it would compress the bass guitar every time that the kick drum reacts. This would be to ensure that the mix has enough low end, the kick is still coming through, and you're not muddying the waters. You don't have this big spike of low end energy. You could take this a step further and do this on a per band basis, or if your DAW does not support sidechaining and you want the same basic overall effect, you could just automate some volume drops for every kick drum if you're really, really bored. But these are some solid examples of the effect on the audio signal path does not necessarily correlate 100% with what's coming in. And you can experiment with that to your heart's desire. For now, I think the best guitarist implementation of this is just some frequency specific stuff. I've been rather vocal on this channel about my pure hatred of playing through compressor pedals when it comes to guitar applications. In front of the amp, in the loop, I don't care. They don't feel good to me. I definitely like them in mixing applications, and they can sound great. Just don't like the way they feel. Again, Wagner-Harlow, transformer saturation, love it. But there is one thing, one application for compression in guitars that I think is absolutely essential, especially for some of the modern day mixing applications. That is multiband compression. Now, it's sort of, tickled the multiband discussion with some of these prior examples with the crossover on the bass, with the band pass on the tape distortion. We're targeting specific frequencies. We don't want everything to be affected equally. And this is one such example. So the Fractal stuff includes this relatively simple 3-band compressor. Of course, the Wave C4 is a total legend and a studio essential. they all kind of do the same sort of thing. They split up the frequency response into how many ever bands they give you, 3, 4, 6, 8. Generally, I feel like most of the time you can just get by with either 3, 4, or stacking 2 and having them affect, different parts if they get really problematic. But they all split them up into these different bands, and you have individual control over the ratio, threshold, attack, release over all of these bands. And it just gives you pinpoint precision on those problematic areas, because there are applications where the frequency response itself isn't always problematic, but if you just use a regular compressor, maybe that big peak in the low end is going to dip the entire volume, and that's not what you want. You want to dynamically decrease the volume of certain ranges, and you can do that with a dynamic EQ as well. A little bit of a different effect, but with these multi-band compressors, I like to use them essentially as palm mute machines on guitar. And of course, this is a super well-known trick. You'll start by essentially taking the crossover frequency for your low band down to somewhere between 100 and 200 hertz. I usually find like 120 to 140 to be the sweet spot for the tunings I play in, and set your ratios and thresholds in such a way that it only really ever triggers on palm mutes. A little bit of gain reduction every now and again isn't such a big deal, but you don't want it just, reducing by 6, 10 dB all the time, no matter what note you're playing. That's not what we're going for. We want those big transient spikes to get under control. That way, if you're, either playing through a mix or you're piping it through the front of house and you're playing with a band, that way you don't have these big spikes that are overwhelming and you'll probably get turned down as a result. You want to be a little less dynamic in that sense and, still be able to poke out in the mix. Attack and release, most of the time, a lot of these plugins and things have a generally pretty good default setting. You do want it fast enough to set that transient. You do want it to recover fast enough to not sound weird. So kind of depends on the tempo of the song there. But when you get that under control, it will sound bigger, more full without losing a whole lot of the punch. I generally don't like mid-range multi-band compression for guitars. Overall, on a mix or a master, it can be fine once everything's glued together. And maybe a touch of high band compression with just a little bit of a boost going on for guitars can work well. A lot of the times high gain amps are already a little compressed in there anyway, so you want to be careful. I guess the final thing to note about multi-band compression is that unlike a lot of the classic compressors we think of when it comes to studio use, like the 1176 or a lot of the fan favorite optical or tube compressors, multi-band compressors are really utilitarian. They are clean. They're not character driven. A lot of those fan favorites, people will set them to have basically no compression and just run tracks through them because they like the character they add. They like the harmonic distortion that the amplifier circuit imparts. These don't do that. These are compressors. That's it. So you have to approach them that way in a surgical and as needed approach, which is fine. That's what they're there for. But don't, expect to just add one of these and get some magic secret sauce on your mix. We've been through some brain twisters on today's video, so I thought I would leave one of the more relaxed examples for last with parallel echo effects. Have you ever had a delay going into reverb or vice versa, or if you're Devin Townsend playing a clean song, delay into reverb into delay, and things just get so out of control? You cannot dial it in to save your life because you play on different ranges of the fretboard and one of them's just super loud and then the trails overtake you, and then you try to turn that down, and now the reverb is too washed out, then you try to balance it back out. Now you can't hear anything but the reverb, and it's a total nightmare. So what you can do instead of trying to put them one after the other is route them in parallel, of course. And this can actually be really advantageous because as you'll hear, especially by the time this gets tracked and compressed and added to a mix, it doesn't really sound that disparate, especially depending on the type of delay model you use. A lot of the times, I think the fear is with stuff like this, that now it no longer blends together. It sounds like you just have a clean repeat on top of a washed out, reverb echo sound. But a lot of the times, some of those delay circuits are already a little diffused, a little bit washed out on their own. And with stuff like the fractal firmware, there is a diffusion control that you can kind of blend in as you see fit. So what this does is you still get that background ambience and you get the obvious hard repeats, and then they kind of blend out together, and you don't have 45 seconds of a little bitty eighth notes going back and forth in the background. This isn't always my cup of tea. I tend to prefer delay into reverb, but if you're having trouble getting it balanced out, or you need just something a little different, one effect is good, but you need a little more definition, add some delay. Or the delay is good, you need just a little more ambience, add some reverb in parallel. This can be really powerful. This was by no means an exhaustive list of how to use parallel processing for just guitars, and definitely not even scratching the surface when it comes to mixing and mastering applications. But hopefully you see the bigger picture here. You see why some of these things get used in the mastering stage and not the mixing stage, how you can apply these to your guitar signal chains, and why we associate certain sounds with certain techniques. If you have any other questions or comments, please leave them down below. Hopefully in probably distant future content, to be realistic, we'll explore some of these concepts in a bigger mix environment, and you'll see how those things all play out. But for now, still having a blast with the FM9, obviously, and hopefully you guys can take some of these learnings and tweak your guitar tones and get even bigger sounds that way. Thank you so very much for watching, as always, and we will see you next time. Bye.